is all Hartmut's work, so he did all the hard work here. Maybe a few words about me. So I'm actually the software or architect of the Brain-Scale software stacks. So we have had different hardware generations, and I have been I try to guide the software development of all the software stacks that we have developed over the decades now. Actually, this software isn't really part of this, but we have some other contributions at the conference here that highlight aspects of the software much better. So, for example, this afternoon, I think Philipp Spielger will talk about plasticity aspects in our software and our hardware, which might be also interesting. And we have a poster on our recent high-level software stacks that are used for machine learning in event-based training. Jackson. Yes, so coming back to this talk here. So this morning in the organizers round, we already heard about this. So conventional computing, I call it here. There are some trends. You can collect data. This data collection here is by Karl Rupp, showing transistors. I think I also have a mouse. Yes. Transistor count, which is nicely increasing. This is a logarithmic scale on the y-axis. Some other aspects aren't really increasing anymore, like maximum frequency. Also, power consumption is somewhat stopping to increase because of the power density problem and cooling problem that you also have. This was also discussed this morning quite a bit. And what was also discussed or mentioned is that there's significant demand from AI applications, training and also applications. And I also added some references here that I think nicely sum up the aspects of the current research or the current state of the art. So what does this mean? So Dennard scaling ended in approximately 2006. So we have all these hardware aspects where I'm really no expert to talk about because I'm a software person. So I won't talk about this. But one of the conclusions that come out of this from the people that care about the future roadmap of hardware development, and those people here that I'm referencing are coming from the conventional computing side of things. They look nowadays at domain-specific hardware accelerators. And you probably all know this. There are GPUs on the right side. You can see some Blackwell, I think, NVIDIA GPU box that does a lot of floating point calculations per second. And we have FPGAs, and we also have more specialized accelerators nowadays. And obviously, neuromorphic hardware is the type of accelerator that we are all interested in. And why do we need this? I try to motivate this here on the slide. So numerical simulation usually is quite nice. Yeah, so you get precision, you get deterministic behavior. Mostly it depends a bit on your level of communication in the distributed computing world. But typically it's all nicely controllable and you know what you get. And you can also, in spiking neural networks, you can also introduce a certain level of parallelism that is that also basically scales nicely. But what you usually can't arbitrarily scale that well is latency to result. Because in the end, you need to calculate individual steps in your numerical framework, and these steps are dependent on each other. So you need to calculate in some kind of sequential fashion, and this limits the maximum speed that you can get from numerical calculations. So here now, given that spiking neural networks follow this event-driven computing paradigm, so they are not vector matrix multipliers or don't do vector matrix multiplication in dense data structures like the artificial neural networks, the non-spiking ones do. So they are sparse in space and time, also mentioned this morning. So there's the possibility to build something that is special for this kind of application here. And by special, I mean it optimizes for sparsity in space and time. And neuromorphic hardware is, in that sense, a complement to traditional simulation. So the neuromorphic hardware is some kind of SNN accelerator. Obviously, there are also other applications, but they are not part of this talk. So here I think about neuromorphic hardware being a spiking neural network accelerator. And this is useful for functional modeling, obviously, because there are opportunities to save energy, to be faster in terms of latency to result. But there are also applications in computational neuroscience. And the latter is what we will be looking at in this talk. And there are also other things that I won't look at, but other people are also looking at this. For example, complex neuron dynamics, plasticity, or other types of use cases. So, quick reminder for those of you who don't know Brain-Scales 1. So this is the Brain-Scales 1, first generation Brain-Scale system. Originally, we built 20 wafer modules. I think today there are only 3 powered, 4 powered. I don't know exactly. This is a bit based on demand. So if more people need to use it, we power on more modules, but usually the majority is idling. This uses Wafer-Scale integration. There have been talks over the past 15 years, I guess. Yeah, not 15, but more than 10 years at NICE conferences about the hardware. So it's 180 nanometer process technology. There are 384 individual chips on a 20 centimeter wafer, and they are interconnected by additional metal layers on top of those. So you have a one wafer communication network. There are 48 FPGAs in one wafer module. So the wafer module is what you can see on the bottom right, that are linked to a conventional control cluster. So where your software runs, your software stack runs via 40 gigabit Ethernet links, one 40 gigabit Ethernet link per wafer maximum. And typically the neuron dynamics run 10,000 times faster than in biology. This means that the typical time constants, which are configurable on the system, but what you typically configure is in the order of 1 microsecond compared to 10 milliseconds for tau mem in a biological neuron. So that's how this time constant or speed up factor comes from. Yes, and the system, the first chip was in our labs in 2008, and the first wafer, I think, was 2013, the full installation 2016, similar to the Brain-Scales 1 system. And nowadays we are commissioning Brain-Scales 2 multi-chip systems. I think if you enter your name on the guided tour list, you will also see some of these systems in the production hall next to this foyer. Yes, so now computational neuroscience. We look at 2 network models which are quite famous. So first of all, balanced random network model by Nicolas Brunel, 2000. There was this paper on different kinds of firing regimes in a balanced random network. Just 2 populations, and they excite each other or inhibit each other. You have external stimulus, and then you basically look at firing statistics. The second model on the right is called the cortical microcircuit network model, which is based on the Potians and Diesmann publication 2012, which resembles or should resemble 1 square millimeter of cortex. There are 8 populations inside, slightly more interesting topology, also external stimulus. The external stimulus is always Poisson distributed spike trains with a certain rate. We also, for some of the models, we sweep the rates and change other parameters just to look at the different firing statistics. Yes, if you look at these original publications, they are all implemented in software. So you have a numerical simulation. Here in analog neuromorphic hardware, you always have limited parameterization ranges. So obviously, there are some adaptations needed to make sure that the models fit on hardware. And what do I mean by that? I will show on in some slides later. But first of all, I will just, as an example, show the mapping of the cortical microcircuit model onto a Brain-Scales 1 wafer module. So first of all, we have the model, which is, if you write this down in a description language like Pine, neural network description language, you just specify 8 populations with a certain parameterization, stochastical distribution of parameters, and interconnections in between. And then basically you want to run it somehow. So there's some software involved. And what we have on the other side, so the hardware backend, is that we have 200,000 analog neuron circuits, 43 million synapses per wafer. And the neurons themselves, in general, they follow adaptive exponential integrated fire dynamics. And you have also configurable maximum fan-in that the neurons can receive. So each neuron, each individual neuron circuit receives 220 inputs, but you can combine multiple neurons to form larger neurons. So basically, logically, they increase, they have an increased fan-in size. What you can't do in the Brain-Scales 1 system is build multi-compartment neurons. That's only possible in the Brain-Scales 2 system, also by combining multiple neuron circuits. I mentioned that the wafer has on-wafer connectivity. Here, I just wrote down that this is a sparse connectivity system. So there's no full matrix where you can basically connect each neuron from each chip to any other neuron. You basically always need to look at the sparsity of the connection network. So there's also a computational problem in there, and that's also solved by our software stack. And on the very top of our software stack, there's the Pine API, which was originally invented for spiky neural network experiments in multiple simulators, but Brain-Scales 1, for example, Spinnaker 1 is also one of these examples. There are several hardware backends that also attach to the Pine description language. And for details, there's also a nice publication by Hartmut, who would have given this talk originally. Yes, so how does it look like? So if I just draw the wafer on the right and color the individual populations of the microcircuit in different colors, I get basically this. That's basically what our software finds out after we constrain it to a certain individual wafer system. And what do I mean by that? As you know, this is analog hardware, so every circuit is slightly different. And there are also some circuits that are basically not working properly, or maybe are not working in the desired parameter range. So what we always do in this modeling applications here is that we have to find out which neurons are available for this type of experiments and where are they located on the wafer. And the software then tries to find the optimum mapping between the user-defined topology and the actual hardware resources that we have available for this target parameterization. And as you can see, there are some boxes that are basically somehow weird. So for example, that one. Yes, my mouse is visible. So here basically we have a chip where no neuron is placed on, and that was just disabled by some commissioning software that found out, okay, there's a problem with this chip and we don't use it for the experiment. All the connections are routed around. We just don't place any neurons on it. Also, similarly, in the center of a wafer, you can see that there's no neurons placed here. And that's because in the center of the wafer, we don't have high-speed readout. And so the high-speed links to the outside world are missing just by construction. So we don't place neurons there because we could not feed in stimulus, and we could also not read out the spike trains from the generated spike trains from the neurons. So yes, that's a nice visualization here, I think. What you can also see is this vertical and horizontal colored lines. That's basically a representation of the inter-chip links. So basically the projections in your network. Yeah. So the bigger borders, the colored borders, mark the populations, and the small, the vertical and horizontal colored lines mark the connections between the populations. Yes, and there's also darker shade means higher neuron count. So for example, this one has a darker shade than this one because there is no shading at all. So this one isn't used at all and stuff like this. Yes, in addition, these models are too large for our wafer system. So even though the balanced random network, for example, has 12,400 neurons, which is lower than our neuron count, and also only 50 million synapses, which is lower than our 43 million synapses, we can't put it on the wafer because the fan-in of this network is higher than the typical fan-in that we have for single circuit neurons. So we have to use multi-circuit neurons, which reduces the amount of neurons that we can logically place, model neurons that we can place onto the wafer structure. So we have to perform something which we call downscaling. So we reduce the size of the network and try to keep the interesting dynamics alive. So, for example, here. So we maintain the original connectivity probability because both models have a probabilistic connection description of network connections, and we compensate for the reduced input per neuron by a linear weight increase. Yeah, and in the case of the microcircuit model, we use an approach that was described originally in 2014, I think, by Sascha van Albada. And also due to this rather random network structure, which is problematic for such symmetric hardware substrates, we also get some additional synapse loss that comes just because there's a certain probability that you still get very high connection probabilities between two chips. And then you basically have to do something about it. And in our case, we just basically chose a trade-off point where the number of additionally of synapses that we could not realize in the hardware model is basically low enough to still have the original dynamics in the system. And in the end, this means that for the balanced random network in the hardware, we implement 2,000 neurons and 690,000 synapses. And for the cortical microcircuit, we have 7,700 neurons and 2.3 million synapses. So basically, it's a 10% scaling for the cortical microcircuit, and for the balanced random network, it's a bit more than 10%. Yes, now looking at some of the interesting results for the balanced random network, for example, here we sweep basically the fraction of inhibitory weight in comparison to the excitatory weight of internal connections and the external drive, or basically the excitability of the individual neurons. And what you can see is basically if you have low inhibition and low thresholds, you get basically high firing rates. On the right side, this is nicely shown in a nest simulation, numerical simulation, so high firing rates on the left. So this is just biological hertz. And on the hardware, while the right side or the lower diagonal looks nicely, the left side isn't good. Yeah, so what you can see here is basically in the area that are marked in red is basically we have a distortion of the network just because our bandwidth is limited. And such things can happen in networks when you implement those on actual hardware. Similarly, for the cortical microcircuit, we looked at firing statistics, and as in the original publication, we extract a 9-second interval of biological time, starting 1 second after experiment onset, and plot this in this for the different populations. So these are the different populations that we have in the microcircuit model. And what we also added, so this is the black and blue lines here. So black is brain scales 1, blue is nest. What we also added is a 1-year line, which means we just waited 53 minutes of our time domain, so void clock time, to reevaluate the network dynamics on brain scales 1. And due to this acceleration factor of 10,000, we have actually waited 1 year of simulated time to reevaluate the system. And as it's expected in this network, we see basically stable firing statistics after 1 year of simulated time in the network. But for other networks, this might be not the case, yeah, and there might be interesting questions to ask after such long waiting periods. And for those questions, it might be useful to have a highly accelerated physical computing substrate. Yes, we put this into a table, comparing this to numerical implementation. So there's Nest, which is a software, general purpose software simulation framework. We also put in Spinnaker 1 that is, and other frameworks. Oh, sorry, this wasn't me. And just looked at available publication and put in their performance numbers. This table is a bit unfair in the sense that we only run a 10% network. Yeah, so this is not a fair comparison because the other publications ran the full size networks. Yeah, so we would either have to somehow scale up to multi-wafer to through multi-wafer implementation to have a comparison, or it would be nice also to have maybe a scaled down network run on the other platforms. And what you can see here is that basically we have a very high number of synaptic events per second on the Wafer-Scale system, Brain-Scales-1 system, and we also have a rather low energy consumption, just because we have this high acceleration factor. And to our knowledge, this presents the fastest operation today, up to today, in terms of number of synaptic events per second in a network that exhibits similarly complex dynamics. Yes. Conclusion. So the speed up from the physical emulation, in this case here in our applications here, is really only evident in long and repetitive emulations. And this comes from the fact that basically any operational overhead that you introduce into a simulation here or emulation here, for example, by reconfiguring the system, by transferring data, basically reduces your effective acceleration factor. I mean, this is obvious. But still, the comparably low energy consumption or power consumption of the Brain-Scales-1 system at this high speed up factor can still yield advantages. Yeah, so in terms of energy efficiency, but also in terms of time to result. And maybe it also enables the research of certain research questions. Yeah, just because you don't have to wait ridiculously long. Yeah, because you have this acceleration factor. On the other hand, obviously, you are limited in the size of the simulation, and you're also limited in the parameterization of the limit of the simulation or emulation. And what's also difficult, if you take the current wafer scale implementation here, going beyond single wafer scale, so basically connecting two wafer modules, although it's possible, it limits your energy efficiency quite a bit, and also limits your bandwidth between the two parts of the network quite a bit. So for efficient multi-wafer scale simulations, you basically need some kind of 3D integration, which we also looked into shortly, but it's not in production. Yes, what's also interesting here is that this co-execution approach, or co-design you could also call it, is also needed. Yeah, so you need to validate and look at network topologies in simulation, because only there you have the full control, and also only there you have the full access to all the observables. On the neuromorphic substrate, like the Brain-Scales-1 system, you're always limited in where you can look at, and yeah, basically how to debug your model on hardware. But still, it might be interesting. So as an outlook, the area efficiency that we have reported here is not great, but we believe this is mostly because we use basically general purpose hardware here, but the networks that we looked at are fully static. Yeah, so we are using plastic synapses, or plastic synapse implementation to run static networks. So basically we are wasting area, just because you could also build much more dense static synapses on a neuromorphic hardware substrate. Second point, Brain-Scales-1 is quite old. Yeah, so this is 180 nanometer CMOS. I think the original process was end of 90s, and we built the first chips in 2009 or 2008. So this is really an old technology node. Newer hardware solves parts of these efficiency problems. Second point here, the comparison against numerical simulation is basically a bit advantageous for this numerical simulation, because what we look at here, the model dynamics that we look at are quite cheap. Yeah, so we have very simple neuron equations. It's just leaky, integrate, and fire. We don't have anything like synaptic plasticity, and we also don't have any complex neuron dynamics. Yeah, so we have basically a lot of the features that you get from a physical computing system you don't make use of here. And what we also didn't do is we didn't do any, I call it, dependent reconfiguration. Yeah, so we just had parameter sweeps, and you could parallelize this in software quite easily. But if you would have to do some kind of guided reconfiguration, so taking the results from a previous run to reparameterize your subsequent run, there you could also make use of this latency to result aspect that I mentioned in the beginning. Yes, and my last slide is just advertisement for Brain-Scales, and with within eBrains. So eBrains is a research infrastructure, and the systems are available via eBrains. Actually, Spinnaker is also available via eBrains. And there's also eBrains software distribution that tries to collect software from machine learning inspired SNN training, computation neuroscience, Atlas, Access libraries, whatever, into one software distribution. And there's also a deployment mechanism. And we also do containers nowadays. And we are integrated. And you can access this after registering for an eBrains account, which you can just do. That's the left QR code. And on the right, you see a QR code which links to actually demos that you can run on the Brain-Scale system using the eBrains infrastructure. Thank you.